This is just the beginning.
Welcome to Axios News Shapers, our first of 2021 Corporate America's Climate Report Card. I'm Mike Allen, a co-founder of Axios. Welcome to my bedroom in Arlington, Virginia. I'll be joined by Ben Geeman, who covers energy and climate for Axios, and Asia Whitaker-Moore, who's our managing editor for Business News. Our thanks to the Bank of America for making these conversations possible, and thank all of you for joining us on the many platforms of Axios virtual events. We'd love for you to follow along. You can go to @Axios and #Axios events. Our first guest is Dr. Rajiv Shah, president of the Rockefeller Foundation, which uses science, data, and innovation to help humanity around the globe. Earlier, Dr. Shah was the head of the U.S. Agency for International Development under President Obama. He worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I've known him from politics going back many years, and he has degrees in both medicine and business. Dr. Shah, welcome to Axios.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's good to be with you.
So we're talking today about America's Climate Report Card, and you're about to plunge into a project that starts with a T, $1 trillion. Tell us what the Rockefeller Foundation is about to get into.
Well, the Rockefeller Foundation has worked for decades to bring science and technology to the needs of the world's, poor, vulnerable, and left behind communities. And I think we're seeing through COVID-19 that economic infrastructure that reaches out, includes everybody, has to start with power, electricity, and ultimately broadband access so that people can participate in a global economy. So we've launched a major effort to end energy poverty. There are 1 billion people on Earth, actually 800 million, that live without any real access to electricity at all, and probably another 1 billion or 1.5 billion on top of that experience the lack of reliable and affordable electricity as their primary constraint to growth and lifting themselves and their families up. We've worked with businesses, technologists, scientists, and companies around the world, and we're launching a major effort to end energy poverty using solar, distributed technology, micro hydro, and all kinds of new solutions that we've now shown can provide power and energy at a much cheaper price point than coal or things that have been relied on for decades, centuries.
Reflecting the fact that I'm in Virginia, you're across the river in DC, there's not a lot of good news these days, but you talk about a global green recovery. It's been a while since we've heard any good news.
Well, if you look at the way the world reacted coming out of 2008, 2009 to the financial crisis, I think history has now shown definitively that we did not do enough in a coordinated way, in particular for lower income communities around the globe. And we have experienced this tremendous divergence as a result. COVID-19 is an accelerant of that divergence. We're now living through the greatest divergence we've seen since World War II in the living standards of people and inequality and inequity as a result of that. So, right now is an important time for the global community to stand up. We're partnering with international institutions to propose and try to enact a $1 trillion global green recovery, which would, if you look at how much monetary and fiscal support richer countries have done to their own economies, it's been about 20 to 30% of GDP, these big policy bills, these big monetary actions. If you look at emerging markets, it's about 6%. And if you look at 60 plus developing countries around the world that house probably 2 billion people, it's been 2%. And that's devastating. So we've worked with the IMF, the World Bank, and others to propose a $1 trillion global green recovery that would in part support efforts to extend renewable electrification and green development pathways to more than 1 billion people around the world.
Now, when we were miking up and when Taylor was fixing our shot, you and I were talking about the fact that over the last year, we've seen a lot more both awareness and action from corporations. And we're talking about America's Corporate Climate Report Card. You were telling me that you had an experience a year ago that was eye-opening for you.
Well, I was at Davos a year ago, and a number of corporate CEOs appropriately were making their commitments to be net neutral on carbon by 2050. And I was on a panel with Greta Thunberg the youngest and most articulate member of our group. And she stood up and said, this is not enough. This is not going to get the job done when you actually just look at the science and the math around carbon. And so it is going to take much more than a series of corporate commitments to get to net neutrality by 2050. And in fact, I'm optimistic because I've seen companies since then do more. I mean, we have a $1 billion joint venture with a major company called Tata Power in India, for example, to roll out 10,000 of these rural solar installations that are able to provide electricity to 10 million people at under 20 cents a kilowatt hour and replace many gigawatts of new coal manufacturing plants in that setting and in that nation. Like that, we need hundreds, thousands of those types of examples. And we do need the corporate sector to step up and just be much more aggressive. This is part of why the Rockefeller Foundation announced at the end of last year, we are divesting of our fossil fuel investments, despite being founded on, of course, the Standard Oil fortune.
Now, I think people think about climate actions as taking place over millennia, but you've actually shown that there can be some swift actions on climate.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if you look at the project I just mentioned, I had a chance to visit some of the beneficiaries who were able to turn lights on in their home, run a sewing machine and increase their income, start a small business in their community, and ultimately send their kids to school, all because of new technologies related to the price point of what off-grid solar energy can provide some of the poorest communities on the planet. And the truth is, we believe in just 10 years, it's possible to end energy poverty, to bring 1 billion people into the modern global economy and move them out of poverty. And we believe doing so would displace literally hundreds of gigawatts of new coal manufacturing, often supported by Chinese financing on concessional terms, from Vietnam to Kenya to Latin America. And it's an urgent issue because 10, 15 years from now, the primary source of the world's carbon emissions will in fact be highly populated emerging economies. And so the decisions they make now as to what kind of economy they want to have 10, 15 years from now will define whether climate change is manageable or climate change is an incredible disaster for the world.
And real quick, where was it that you visited the sewing machine? Just take us there for a second.
Sure. We were in a northeastern state in India called Bihar. It's one of the lowest income communities on earth, certainly in India. And we visited villages that we've now, the Rockefeller team, together with our joint venture partners, have rolled out more than 500 of these mini grids serving almost 400,000 people. So we just went house to house and we talked to people who were customers, and we learned a lot of simple things. The first is they loved being a customer. They paid their bills. They sustained these businesses. These are growing, profitable enterprises. The second is having electricity. I mean, you, Mike, and I appreciate this every day, right? We wake up and every minute of our day, we're benefiting from having a tremendously high volume of energy consumption. These are families that don't consume any electricity. Then when they want to fire, when they want to cook, they send the girls into outside to collect firewood and bring it indoors. Their agricultural output is lower because they don't process product effectively afterwards. It's an extraordinary and very sad way to get through an existence. But when you see what they're able to do, once they can plug in, all of a sudden they're starting businesses, they're creating jobs, they're sending their kids to school, and they're on that upward path of mobility that can redefine a sense of possibility and hope for hundreds of millions, and we think 1 billion people that live this way. And we think this is incredibly achievable right now, which is why we have done some special financing actions to make the largest single investment in our 107-year history in this one project.
Going back to your work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, you personally have had a great interest in vaccines and global health, continuing with your work as the head of the US AID. Over the last year, after all of our lives, ever since World War II, a great convergence in the world, we've been seeing a great divergence.
Well, we have, the big positive story of the last 25 years has been, hundreds of millions of people moving out of poverty, children that under the age of 5 who used to die 11, 12 million children a year in 1990 had come down to 5 million a year just a year and a half ago. And unfortunately, now we're seeing COVID-19 wipe out 2 decades of that human development improvement and set us back 20 years in terms of human development outcomes and indicators around the planet. And it is really our belief that if that trend continues, the world we will all live in together 10, 15, 20 years from now will be so deeply inequitable and so marred by pockets of violence and loss of hope in so many communities around the world that we felt we had to just take special action. So the Rockefeller Foundation committed $1 billion of our philanthropic spending to a global green recovery to avoid this great divergence. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure that the recovery lifts up everybody. Think about this, in just put it in numbers. The world's 2,200 billionaires have made $2 trillion in the last year, while the World Bank estimates that 425 million people will be pushed back into the kind of poverty I just described of the family that I visited in Bihar. That's not the kind of world we want to live in. We can do better than that.
Well, and you talk about in the vaccine world about how there could be real new threats to America if we're not paying attention.
Yeah, it's very easy to think, well, you just vaccinate your population and get back on planes and restart your economy and move on. And that euphoria, I think, also is underlying some of the market enthusiasm we see these days. The reality is, it now looks like it might be 3 to 4 years before there's meaningful herd immunity achieved through vaccination in developing nations around the world. If that is true, that means for the next 3 to 4 years, there are huge pockets of viral replication around the world, outside of our nation. And in that context, those new variants of those viruses will become global variants. And it is highly likely that some of them invalidate the tools and technologies like monoclonal antibodies or even the vaccines that we are so dependent on today. We're already seeing that a little bit with the South African variant. There are lots of variants everywhere. We're just not looking for them. As we start to look for them, we're going to see that we're all in this together. We can't just solve this problem in America and move on. We have to exhibit the kind of strong global leadership that has characterized American leadership in the past, and I think will characterize American leadership going forward.
This has been pretty heavy. As you know, I end my morning newsletter, Axios AM, with a smile to go or one fun thing after a topic like this. We needed more than ever. We like to end our events, conversations this way. And I understand that in shutdown, your young family has a new tradition.
Well, I don't think they're going to like me talking about it, but we yes, our little new activity has been family dance parties that I DJ, and part of this was I realized you could download an app and read a book and learn how to become a really bad DJ. So we do that every now and then, and not something the kids like to advertise to their friends, but it is super fun.
It's probably better to be a bad DJ than a bad dancer.
Yeah, that's probably true. I think I'm actually getting pretty good. I enjoy it.
Great. Dr. Shah, president of the Rockefeller Foundation, thank you for joining Axios.
Thanks, Mike. Great to be here.
Thank you to the Bank of America for making these conversations possible. And now we're going to see a quick video from the Bank of America.
I'm Ben Gieman, energy reporter and author of the daily Axios Generate newsletter. I'm coming to you from my home in Silver Spring, Maryland. Our final guest today is the Chief Environmental Officer at Microsoft, Dr. Lucas Joppa. Dr. Joppa, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Microsoft is exactly, or close to exactly, maybe a few days past, 1 year into this ambitious pledge to be carbon negative by 2030. So with 1 year of this under your belt, I'm kind of wondering, what surprised you? What's been easier or harder than you thought? Have there been any rakes that you have stepped on at this point?
Yeah, quite a few rakes in our path. Your intro was actually the same struggle that I had when I was writing our anniversary blog, because it wasn't exactly 1 year, but it was almost 1 year. So, it was almost exactly a year ago that we made this commitment to be a carbon negative company. We then followed it over the next 12 months with a series of commitments that ended up with us being a carbon negative, water positive, zero waste company that's building out the foundations of what we're calling a planetary computing platform and protecting more land than we use, all by 2030. And what, a lot of people have heard about those high level commitments that Microsoft has made. Not a lot of people are as aware that while we were making those commitments, we were also in parallel working to implement a lot of our carbon negative commitments at the same time. And as part of our 1 year anniversary, we issued an update on our carbon negative work. And the high level is that a year ago, we committed that by 2030, we'd reduce our emissions by half or more and remove the rest. And over the past calendar year, we actually reduced our emissions by 6%, emissions reduction rate that if we keep on track, will see us meeting or achieving our commitments by 2030. And we announced the release of our carbon removal RFP, the largest carbon removal RFP to our knowledge that the world's ever seen. We asked for 6 months ago, we asked for 1 million metric tons of carbon removal from the market. We're really pleased to be able to produce a lot of assets, a carbon removal white paper with all of our learnings, and highlighting the projects that we ended up purchasing from, about 1.3 million metric tons of carbon removal that we'll have purchased this year.
So for our audience, can you translate that 1.3 million metric tons? How would we relate to that? How many, average homes worth of emissions is that? Or how many average cars worth of emissions is that? What does that 1.3 million, mean? Take us beyond the abstraction of that number, please.
So you can think of it, I guess, as, lots of different ways you can think about it. One way that sticks in my head is it's about 1 million passenger vehicles driven for about a year. So your average passenger vehicle annual use, take 1 million of those cars on the road. That's that amount of emissions. So it's not trivial. But I think our president, Brad Smith, wrote a blog last week announcing these high-level findings. And I really like the framing that he used. This is both a giant leap and a small step. So we were able to reduce our emissions 6%. We were able to procure this 1.3 million metric tons of CO2 removal. But we know that the world in 2030 has to be in a fundamentally different place than it is today if we are going to meet our goals, much less if the world is going to put itself on track to be a net zero carbon economy by 2050.
Definitely. I'm glad you brought that up. And of course, a lot of companies are making net zero or net negative pledges of some sort now. Your out year is fairly soon, relatively speaking, 2030. But regardless of when the date is, not every company's different, and not every company has the balance sheet of a Microsoft, of course. So I guess what I'm wondering is, given the need for many companies across the spectrum to be reducing emissions, what are some of the things that you've learned that you would be able to share, and what lessons are perhaps applicable to companies of other types who are seeking to implement similar types of emissions reductions?
Your question gets at my biggest worry, quite frankly, for Microsoft's carbon negative goals, which is that we end up meeting it, but we end up meeting it in a way that hasn't made it easier for everybody else. We all know there aren't that many Microsofts of the world, right? And so it's incumbent upon us that have more to do more, but it's also incumbent that we do more in a way that makes it easier for everybody to follow. And we know with carbon reduction and carbon removal that there's a lot of market maturation and a lot of other societal scale changes that need to happen. We issued our annual report, our first annual sustainability report last week, as well as part of this annual update. And in it, we talk about these 6 enabling conditions that are going to have to be true in the world if we are going to be able to easily and efficiently meet our carbon commitments, both in Microsoft and for the rest of the world. Things like setting standards and digitization of data all the way down to a policy progression, because we know that voluntary commitments through corporate actors like Microsoft are extremely important, but they're not going to be enough to solve our environmental issues alone.
What are some of the most important policy drivers and policy changes you think the new incoming or now here Biden administration could implement, especially using its executive authorities, but perhaps with Congress, in order to help both your company and other companies with carbon negative or net zero pledges actually successfully implement them to really drive that emissions curve downward?
Well, I'm sure you were eagerly anticipating the suite of executive orders that were issued last week. I was as well. I know anybody who cares about sustainability and climate action around the world was watching to see. I think we saw some really good things. I think, first and foremost, this whole of government approach is going to be critical. We can't treat sustainability as a vertical, right? We need every agency, every department, every procurement decision to factor this in. That's what we're doing at Microsoft, and that's what we need the US government to be doing. So seeing an executive order on this whole of government approach, really then going down into some of the practical details about putting procurement at play. We know that the government is a very large procurer. We need to make sure that that procurement is sending a signal to the market now that there's demand for solutions that must be ready by 2030. That's what Microsoft's doing. That's what we need the government to do. And then finally, I would just say, getting back in Paris, that's huge. But even bigger is ensuring that we deliver our commitment to our nationally determined contributions. We saw action on that, a commitment, I think it was April. We should be looking to see the US NDCs announce. That finally gives us some solid footing to hold ourselves and our country accountable for what we need to achieve. And then, you mentioned it. I think we're all excited to see these executive orders from the private sector. Those executive orders are great, but the meaningful, lasting, predictable impacts that legislation can deliver instead of simply executive order action. That's what, that's the grand prize here, I think.
And, one of the other things I thought was interesting about your announcement of where things stand a year in was the fairly candid acknowledgement that what you can do on your own when it comes to carbon removal is very much sort of a drop in the bucket, both significant for a single company, but a drop in the overall bucket. One of the things that I thought was interesting was the discussion of sort of joint collective efforts with other buyers of carbon removal to sort of push the market forward. How do you go about doing that? And does that raise any type of anti-competitive or legal problems? Can companies all just sort of hold hands and do this together in a way that sort of passes legal muster?
Well, look, I think that, anything that you have to do according to the letter of the law. I think we've shown through the history of Microsoft that when there needs to be coordinated action to inspire markets, to incentivize change, that we can do that in accordance with best practices. We can aggregate individual private sector actors in a way that makes sense for the market and makes sense for competition. I think that you saw 6 months ago when we announced the Transform to Net Zero Coalition, a coalition of 9 companies, all deeply dedicated to sustainability, putting together the playbooks, the roadmaps for other private sector actors to follow along so they don't have to make the mistakes that we have over our past decade of action. There's ways to bring folks together to do this in a voluntary manner. But this raises as well, it's easier when you're being driven across a level playing field through lasting legislation.
And with our remaining time, I wanted to ask you to look into your crystal ball a little bit. The other day, you announced some new investments from your innovation fund, including the Swiss direct air capture company, Climeworks. That's a very nascent and scarcely deployed technology right now, although I think people see some substantial growth potential. If you could sort of look forward and perhaps give us a preview, what are some other promising technologies you think might be ripe for innovation from subsequent investments from this innovation fund?
Well, for sure, direct air capture, machines sucking carbon out of the air. It's a nascent technology, needs the investment structure that a climate innovation fund like Microsoft's $1 billion fund can bring. But also, there's a lot of technology opportunities in what we call the nature-based solutions, afforestation, reforestation, soil carbon sequestration. Evolution has already matured those biological technologies, and now the key bit is to figure out how we can take our computational technologies and catch up to be able to ensure that what biology is doing on our behalf through carbon sequestration in a more natural way, that we can monitor it, that we can verify and validate it, and that we can have that certainty that the investments that we're making into nature-based solutions is actually delivering the carbon removal results and impact that we all had hoped for when we made those original investments. I'm very bullish on the intersection of engineered technology and evolutionary kind of biological technology over the next 10 years. I think that's really key to unlocking the true carbon sequestration potential that the natural world offers.
Well, it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch, and it's really not that far away. And so with that, Dr. Joppa, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joppa. And up next, we have a video from our sponsor, Bank of America.
Philanthropy is important, but not nearly enough to address the world's issues. If you do a commercial bank, a development bank, a nonprofit, even a private equity fund, and you blend all of our work together, we can stand up things just we couldn't have done before. And we have examples now of that. It's a wind farm in the North Sea. It's 30,000 solar paneling of homes in Spain. And in the case of water.org, Gary White opened a checking account. We get involved in a local level. We contributed some money to his cause. And as time went on and his goals and his vision grew, we grew in terms of our giving. They came forward with an idea of creating a fund. It's simply this, a pretty safe investment. You would get about a 3% return, which is better than what you'd get from a government bond. So this is a way to sustain and to grow it over time. $50 million is a lot better than, $500,000 at a time.
Thank you to Bank of America for making these conversations possible. And now for our Why It Matters segment, I'm joined by Asia Whitaker-Moore, who's Axios' managing editor for business. Asia is one of the greatest additions to Axios in the last year, has run global teams of business reporters, including ones who cover energy and climate. Asia, it looks like you have a little more snow in New York than we do in Virginia.
We've got just a few more inches. We're digging our way out.
So Asia, one big change, and we're looking at corporate America's climate report card, is that a record number of companies, 10,000 plus, now disclose the environmental footprints. And when we were talking as we were miking up, you said there's one specific example of that really stands out.
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely seeing that investors and employees alike are demanding that transparency. And I think that Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, is probably the latest and biggest example of somebody advocating for big change in that area. BlackRock's the largest investor in the world. And they, recently put companies on notice saying, we are encouraging you to disclose your climate risk and do that now, and also disclose what your plans are for the future to be in line with the Paris Agreement's targets that end in 0 by 2050. So he's also putting his money behind that and saying, we are going to vote our shares against managers and directors that are not showing significant progress there.
And we're seeing this increase in pledges, transparency, actions, words. What are the mega trends that are driving CEOs, companies, business to engage more on climate?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the pandemic has been that it's coincided with a real acceleration in ESG investing and interest in that from investors and employees who are who have identified this as a huge risk to their livelihoods, their businesses, and they're really demanding more transparency and more action.
Asia, one of the biggest business stories of 2021, before GameStop, I guess, was GM pledging to be carbon neutral by 2040. And that really has their competitors scrambling. What drove that?
I think some of the trends we're seeing are one around, there being a new administration and the fact that, we've seen recent trust barometers from Edelman saying, business is the only U.S. institution right now that's thought of as being ethical and competent enough to handle the world's problems. And that gives CEOs real room to lead on change on some of these issues. And I think GM and Mary Barra are a big example of that. GM's also taking advantage of a new administration who has, been very vocal about their goals around electric vehicles and moving the automotive industry in that direction. And GM is definitely a leader there and calling for change among its competitors.
And Asia, as we say goodbye, the ultimate why it matters. What's the biggest change in covering the intersection of business and climate?
I think, reporters, analysts, and investors who are looking at these companies are now having to factor in their ability to, move in the direction that the country is going, and they have to factor that into how they are valuing the company, how they're analyzing it, and it's really become more than a talking point, but a big line of analysis in how you look at a company.
Asia Whitaker-Moore, thank you for joining this Axios News Shapers.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me.
And thank all of you for joining us. We'd love to have conversation every day, so check us out at axios.com/newsletters. We thank the Bank of America for making these conversations possible, and we'd love to see you again soon. So on February 4th, we kick off our Axios local events in Tampa Bay. After that, we'll be hitting the Twin Cities, Des Moines, Denver, Charlotte, and more. So we'd love to see you for that. In the meantime, I'm Mike Allen. I'll see you on Axios.com.